It started like any other day when the sun was high in the sky and the sound of distant traffic hummed through the neighborhood, but everything changed when he pulled up to his driveway. After a long day at work, his eyes immediately landed on the silver car that was parked in front of his house, blocking the entire driveway. His heart sank as frustration bubbled up inside him. He had a busy evening ahead, and now he was stuck, unable to get out of his own driveway. The car that had caused this inconvenience was parked haphazardly, taking up not just part of the driveway, but all of it. He could see the driver's side window rolled down, and the woman sitting in the car tapping her fingers on the wheel, as if she had all the time in the world. It didn't take long for him to notice the license plate. It was clear she was from the neighborhood, a woman he had seen around but never spoken to. He quickly got out of his car, walked over to her window, and knocked gently, trying to keep his voice calm. When she rolled it down, he smiled politely and said, "Excuse me, could you move your car so I can get out? I have somewhere I need to be." But she didn't respond with any civility. Instead, she gave him a sharp glance as if he had just interrupted her most precious moment of the day. Her eyes narrowed as she glared at him, as if his very presence was an annoyance. She said nothing, just waved him off in an exaggerated motion, dismissing him without a word. He stood there in disbelief for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. She hadn't even acknowledged him as a human being, let alone a neighbor who simply wanted to get out of his own driveway. The frustration swelled inside him, but he took a deep breath and walked back to his car. He had to do something. He couldn't just let her block him in and not expect any consequences, so he made a quick decision. He pulled his car behind hers and parked, blocking her in completely. There was no turning back now. He had to make sure she understood the trouble she was causing. He had no intention of letting her get away with this kind of disrespect. The moment his car was in place, he looked over at her. She was sitting there staring ahead at the road like nothing had happened, but he knew she was probably fuming by now. His heart raced with anticipation as he waited for her to react. It wasn't long before she snapped out of her trance and finally noticed that she was now trapped. She threw open her door in an exaggerated motion, almost as if she were on the verge of exploding. She walked toward him, her heels clicking on the pavement, each step heavier than the last. She was seething with anger, and the look on her face was one of utter disbelief. How dare he block her? And how dare he make her face any consequences for her actions? She raised her voice, immediately shouting about how he was causing problems for her and accusing him of being unreasonable. He couldn't help but feel a bit of satisfaction seeing her so rattled, but he stayed calm and tried to explain once more that he simply wanted her to move her car so he could leave. But that only seemed to make her more enraged. She wasn't listening to anything he had to say. And then she did the unthinkable. She pulled out her phone and started dialing 911, her voice shaking as she spoke into the phone, demanding that the police come and take care of him. It was hard to believe what was happening. He was just trying to get out of his driveway, and now she was involving the police. He couldn't help but wonder just how far she was willing to take this. He glanced at the distant sound of sirens growing louder, and he knew things were about to get even more complicated. As the sirens grew louder and louder, he stood there staring at Karen with disbelief. She was still on the phone with 911, pacing back and forth in a frantic motion as she argued with the dispatcher about how she was being harassed over a trivial parking issue. He could hardly believe what he was hearing. How could anyone take her seriously? He was just a neighbor trying to get out of his driveway, yet somehow she had twisted the whole situation to make it seem like he was the villain. He felt a rush of frustration as the sound of the approaching sirens sent a chill down his spine. He had no idea what would happen next, but he knew one thing for sure: Karen was not going to back down easily. He had dealt with unreasonable people before, but this woman seemed to be on a whole different level. When the police finally arrived, he could see the flashing lights in the rearview mirror, their red and blue glow reflected off the cars parked along the street. As they pulled into the driveway, it only took a few moments for two officers to step out of a squad car. One was tall and broad-shouldered, with a no-nonsense look on his face, while the other was shorter but just as serious. They both approached him first, before turning to Karen, who was still ranting and waving her arms around like a madwoman. he couldn't help but notice how she exaggerated every word, as if trying to make herself the victim in all of this. One officer glanced at him and asked what was going on. He explained the situation calmly, telling them that Karen had blocked his driveway and refused to move when asked politely. He made sure to mention how he had simply parked behind her car to prevent her from driving away until she moved hers out of the way. The officers listened carefully without interrupting, nodding every now and then while Karen continued to yell in the background. They then turned to Karen, who was still on the phone, demanding that someone arrest him for causing her trouble. The taller officer spoke in a calm but firm tone, asking her to explain her side of the story. She immediately started blaming him, accusing him of being rude and uncooperative. She claimed that he had deliberately blocked her in and refused to let her leave when she needed to get somewhere important. But the more she spoke, the less convincing her story became. He could see the officers exchanging glances as they tried to process what was happening. It was clear that they weren't buying her version of events. The shorter officer looked at Karen with a raised eyebrow and said, "We need you to move your car so we can sort this out." While the taller officer turned back to him and asked if he was okay, he nodded, feeling relieved that at least the officers were seeing things from his perspective. But just as the situation seemed to be calming down, Karen dropped a bombshell. She suddenly pointed at him, accusing him of doing something far worse than blocking her driveway. She claimed that there was something shady going on and that she had seen him acting suspiciously earlier in the day. She had no evidence, of course, but the accusation was enough to shift the officer's attention for a moment. They paused and looked at him with a new level of scrutiny. This wasn't over yet, and he could feel his heart racing as he realized that the real trouble was just beginning. The officers exchanged uncertain glances as Karen continued to make wild accusations about him being up to something shady, but he could tell that the more she spoke, the less credible she seemed. Her voice trembled with hysteria as she pointed at him, accusing him of acting suspicious earlier in the day. But he knew there was nothing to back up her claim, not a single piece of evidence to suggest anything out of the ordinary had happened. He stayed calm, knowing that the more composed he was, the more likely the officers would start questioning her instead of him. Still, her words seemed to have shaken the officers for a moment as they gave him another weary look. The taller officer spoke first, asking him if he had any idea what Karen was talking about. He explained that he had been home all day working on a project and hadn't left the house at all except for the short trip to get his car out of the driveway. That was the only interaction he'd had with anyone all day. The officers nodded and glanced at Karen, who was still going on about how she had seen him acting weird around the neighborhood earlier that week. But when they asked her for any specifics, she couldn't provide a single detail. Her story was unraveling more and more. With every word she said, she wasn't making sense anymore. It was clear to him that she was grasping at straws, trying to make him seem like the bad guy, but he could also see that the officers were starting to get frustrated with her. They asked her if she had any proof of her claims. She just shook her head and started ranting even louder about how he had blocked her in on purpose and how he was causing her an unimaginable inconvenience. The shorter officer sighed and looked at his partner, who gave a quick nod before turning back to Karen and saying, "We're going to need you to calm down and move your car out of the way so we can finish this up." Karen looked like she might explode at any moment, but surprisingly she didn't argue. She just huffed and stormed back to her car as the officers motioned for him to move his car so they could clear the situation up once and for all. As he got into his car, he couldn't help but feel a sense of victory in the small victory that had just occurred. Karen had made a fool of herself in front of the officers, and now he was about to leave the scene and get on with his day. But just as he started to shift his car into reverse, something caught his eye, a small detail that he had missed earlier. While he was focused on Karen's erratic behavior, he looked more closely at her car now that it was in the light and noticed something strange. There was a scratch on the rear bumper, but it wasn't just any scratch. It was a deep dent that looked like it had been caused by another vehicle. The car hadn't been parked there for long, but the damage looked older than it should have been. He quickly realized that it wasn't just the parking situation that was unusual. This was the kind of thing that could cause even more problems than Karen's parking stunt. ever could. He knew now that Karen had no idea what he had just uncovered, and that discovery could turn everything upside down for her. He stared at the dent in the rear bumper of Karen's car, his mind racing, trying to piece together what he had just seen. It wasn't the kind of thing someone would usually notice. But the more he looked at it, the clearer it became. The damage was not recent. It looked like it had been caused by a heavy impact, maybe even a hit and run, the kind of thing that would normally go unnoticed. But with Karen's wild accusations and her escalating behavior, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this than just a parking dispute. The officers were still standing nearby talking to each other, but they seemed distracted by the scene as a whole. They hadn't noticed what he had discovered yet. So he took a deep breath and made his decision. He had to speak up now. He rolled down his window and casually asked the officers if they had noticed the dent in Karen's car. The taller officer turned his head and looked over at the bumper, then back at him with a questioning look. Yeah, we saw it. What about it? He hesitated for a moment, trying to find the right words to explain without making it seem like he was overreacting. But this was something he couldn't ignore. It was too suspicious. It seemed like Karen had been trying to hide something, and now it was staring them all in the face. He decided to go for it and spoke carefully. There's something off about that dent. I don't think it's from when she parked here. It looks older, like something happened before she even got here. The officer looked at the dent again, more closely this time, as Karen was getting back into her car, her face flushed with irritation. She clearly didn't want anyone to pay attention to the damage. But it was too late now. The shorter officer moved closer to the dent and inspected it for a few moments. He turned to Karen and asked, when did this happen? She immediately grew defensive, her eyes darting back and forth as if she was searching for an escape from the question. She hesitated before replying, it's just a scratch, nothing to worry about. But the officer wasn't buying it. He continued to ask her questions about when the damage occurred and whether or not she had been involved in any accidents recently. Karen's story started to crumble even further. She couldn't keep her story straight, and with every answer she gave, the officers grew more suspicious. They started asking about her whereabouts and whether she had been in any other neighborhoods recently. Karen's frustration boiled over, and she snapped, I've already told you. It's nothing, just forget about it. But it was clear that the officers weren't about to let it go. They asked her if they could take a look at her registration and insurance, just to check the history of the car. Karen's face went pale. She knew she was caught. She tried to cover up her panic by fidgeting with her keys, but it was too obvious now. She had tried to paint herself as the victim in this entire situation, but she was far from innocent. He watched as the officers turned their attention fully to Karen now. There was no more talk about the driveway or the 911 call. The officers were more interested in what else Karen was hiding than anything else. Her attempts to deflect and change the subject were failing, and he couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction, knowing that this discovery was about to reveal more than she had ever anticipated. The officers asked Karen to step out of her car while they ran her registration and insurance to check for any discrepancies. She reluctantly complied with their request, but there was a noticeable shift in her demeanor. She was no longer shouting or ranting. Her posture was tense, her face a mask of frustration and fear. He could see the tension in her body language as she stood there waiting for the officers to finish their checks. It was clear she wasn't comfortable with the situation now that the focus had shifted from him to her, and he couldn't help but feel a sense of relief, knowing that the truth was finally starting to come to light. As the officers continued to go over the car's information, the shorter officer stepped aside and asked him to wait for a moment. He nodded and glanced over at Karen, who was nervously glancing around as if trying to figure out her next move. She knew her cover was blown, and she didn't know what to do about it. The tall officer returned to her after a few minutes with a serious look on his face. He had run the details through their system, and the results were troubling. Her registration was up to date, but the history of the car didn't match the damage on the bumper at all. There was an incident report filed for the same make and model of her car being involved in a hit-and-run accident a few days ago, a collision that had left the same dent in the same spot. Karen's face drained of color as the officer explained the situation. She started to stammer her words, no longer confident in her story. She tried to explain that it was just a coincidence, but her voice cracked as she spoke. It was clear she was panicking, trying to come up with any explanation to avoid being caught in a lie. The officers remained calm and firm, asking her again about the incident she had been involved in, but she refused to answer them directly. Instead, she kept repeating that it wasn't important, that she hadn't done anything wrong. She tried to redirect the conversation back to him, accusing him of causing her problems over nothing. But the officers weren't buying her excuses anymore. The taller officer reached into his pocket and pulled out a phone, showing her a photo of the dent in her car taken by someone who had witnessed the hit and run. The photo was clear, and it was undeniable. The car in the picture was hers. There was no way she could deny it any longer. Karen's body stiffened as she realized there was nowhere left to hide. She had been caught, and she knew it. She could feel the weight of the officers' gaze as they stared at her, waiting for a response. But she remained silent. All the bravado she had once displayed had evaporated, and now she was just a woman trapped by her own lies. The shorter officer moved closer to her, speaking in a calm but authoritative voice, telling her that the dent in her car and the hit and run report would need to be investigated further. They informed her that her car would be impounded for a full inspection and that she might be facing charges for failing to report the accident. It was in that moment when Karen realized how much trouble she was truly in. All her bluster and accusations had been for nothing. She was no longer in control of the situation, and now it was her turn to face the consequences for her actions. He watched from a distance as Karen's world crumbled around her, all because of a simple mistake and the discovery he had made just by paying attention. As the officers began their investigation and Karen's car was carefully inspected, he couldn't help but feel a sense of quiet satisfaction. He had come into this situation just trying to get out of his own driveway, and now he was watching as Karen's lies unraveled right in front of her. The officers spoke to her in calm but firm tones, telling her they were going to search the car for any other evidence that could help with the investigation. Karen didn't say a word now. She just stood there, her arms crossed and her eyes fixed on the ground. She looked like a person who had lost control of everything that had been in her grasp moments ago. But it wasn't over yet. Karen had been so focused on creating a false narrative about him that she hadn't realized she had dug herself into a deeper hole. With every word she said, he couldn't understand how someone could get so caught up in their own lies and accusations. But Karen had done just that. The officers were now more interested in her than they were in him. The situation had shifted completely, and it was clear they weren't going to let her off the hook so easily. He stood there watching as they took more pictures of her car and checked the damage more thoroughly. They were carefully documenting everything, and it was becoming increasingly clear that Karen was about to face serious consequences for trying to cover up the hit and run accident. The tension in the air was thick. He could see the look on Karen's face as she started to realize that she wasn't going to walk away from this scot-free. No matter how much she protested, no matter how much she tried to shift the blame, she was now caught in her own web of lies, and the truth had come to light. The officers asked Karen to follow them to the police car for further questioning. As they started to take her details down, he couldn't help but feel a little bit of pity for her. He had never imagined that a simple parking dispute would lead to this, but it seemed Karen had underestimated the consequences of her actions. She had thought she could bully him into moving out of the way and get away with it, but now she was facing much more serious charges and a much larger problem than just a blocked driveway. He glanced over at her one last time as she was escorted away by the officers. She didn't make eye contact with him. Her head was down and her face flushed with embarrassment. He couldn't help but feel a small sense of triumph, knowing that she had been exposed for what she truly was, a woman who would go to extreme lengths to avoid accountability. It was a bitter victory for him, but a victory nonetheless. The officers returned to him and briefly explained what was going to happen next. They told him he was free to go, but they advised him to stay in touch in case they needed any additional information for their investigation. He nodded and thanked them before getting into his car. He was finally able to leave the scene, but as he drove away, he couldn't stop thinking about how a simple misunderstanding had led to a much bigger and more complex situation than he had ever anticipated. He had uncovered something about Karen that she had been desperately trying to hide, and in doing so had ensured that she would face the consequences of her actions. It was a day he wouldn't soon forget. As he drove away from the scene, the weight of the day began to settle in his mind. The tension that had been building up for hours slowly started to release, but a new sense of curiosity took its place. He couldn't stop thinking about Karen and the things she had been hiding, the way she had tried to manipulate the entire situation to make him seem like the villain, made him wonder just how far she had been willing to go to cover up her past mistakes. The hit and run incident was just the tip of the iceberg. He realized there was probably so much more to the story than she had let on, and now the officers were digging into her history. They were going to find out everything she had tried so hard to conceal. He shook his head as he turned onto his street, his mind still replaying the moments that had unfolded just hours earlier. He hadn't expected his day to go like this, not in a million years, but now that it had, he couldn't ignore the feeling that something bigger was at play. There was something more to Karen than just the angry woman who blocked his driveway. He pulled into his driveway and parked, but as he sat there staring at his house, his thoughts drifted back to the one detail that had stood out above everything else: the dent on Karen's car. The weight had been there long before he had even come across her car, blocking his driveway. The officers had been right to investigate further. They had uncovered a hit-and-run report linked to her car. But what else was there to discover about her? What kind of person would go to such lengths to avoid the consequences of their actions? He couldn't shake the feeling that Karen was hiding something much darker than just a traffic accident, something that had led her to act the way she had. He sat in his car for a few minutes longer before deciding to head inside, but his curiosity still gnawed at him. He knew he had no real reason to keep investigating Karen's past, but the thought of her being involved in something much bigger than just a parking dispute kept lingering in his mind. What if there were more people she had hurt? What if she had been using her charm and lies to get away with things for years? What if this was just the beginning of her unraveling? He sighed and grabbed his phone, scrolling through it aimlessly for a few moments before making a decision. He wasn't someone who typically got involved in other people's business, but this felt different. He felt like he had a responsibility now to find out more, not just for himself, but for anyone else who might have been impacted by her actions. His fingers hovered over the search bar as he typed in Karen's full name along with her car's make and model. The results appeared instantly, but as he scrolled through them, his eyes widened as more details popped up that he had never expected to find. There were news articles and reports from years ago about similar incidents involving her, but none of them had been publicized. He realized that Karen had managed to stay under the radar for a long time, but now her past was beginning to catch up with her, and he was at the center of it all without even realizing it. He felt a shiver run down his spine as he wondered just how deep this rabbit hole really went, and what he had gotten himself into by merely standing up for his right to park in his own driveway. As he stared at the screen, his mind raced, trying to process everything he had just discovered. The search results were overwhelming and full of unsettling details. Karen had managed to keep a low profile for years, but now he was seeing a pattern that went beyond just a single hit-and-run accident. Her name was tied to multiple incidents, some of which were decades old. There were reports of her being involved in small thefts, insurance frauds, and even a few shady business dealings that had never made the headlines. It was like Karen had been operating in the shadows for years without anyone catching on, and now everything was starting to unravel at once. He scrolled further down the page and found a few more chilling articles about her, most of them detailing complaints from previous neighbors and people she had crossed paths with over the years. Each account painted a picture of someone who was manipulative and deceitful, someone who would do whatever it took to get what they wanted, no matter the cost. He could feel a cold unease creeping up his spine as the weight of it all sank in. He wasn't just dealing with a woman who had blocked his driveway and called 911 over a petty issue. He was up against someone who had a history of causing problems and getting away with it. He sat back in his chair, trying to process the implications of everything he had just read. Karen's ability to manipulate situations and people had clearly worked in her favor for years, But now that she had crossed paths with him, he couldn't help but feel like there was no going back. He had unknowingly become a part of her story, and now he was left wondering how far she was willing to go to keep her secrets buried. What if she came after him next? What if this was only the beginning of a much larger game she was playing? The thought made his heart race. He had no idea how much danger he could be in if Karen truly had the ability to manipulate people so easily. What else was she capable of? But then he stopped himself and reminded himself that the officers were already involved. They had her car impounded. They were going to investigate everything, and it wasn't just him anymore. They were going to find out the truth about Karen, even if she tried to cover it up. He glanced at the clock and realized how much time had passed since he had returned home. The day had turned into evening, and he had spent hours going through every article, every report, and every piece of information he could find about Karen. He had learned more about her in one afternoon than he had ever wanted to know. But despite the anxiety creeping up on him, he felt a sense of relief too. It was no longer just his word against hers. The truth was coming to light, and he wasn't the only one who had been affected by her actions. He wasn't sure what the next steps would be, or how Karen would react to everything that was unfolding. But he knew one thing for certain: she wasn't going to get away with it anymore. The game was over, and she had underestimated him. He wasn't just a neighbor anymore. He was part of something bigger now, and the truth was going to come out no matter how hard Karen tried to hide it.